All right, so this is where we had stopped in the last class. We were discussing radius to frequency mapping. Now, one thing I wanted to mention here is that the emission components in radio pulsars, some of them actually show this kind of behavior. That is, you go to lower frequencies, you see the distance between components increasing or the profile widening. But there are some of the radiation components that are found in radio pulsars which don't share this. In addition, they don't share some other properties. For example, we already talked about the rotating vector model. So you have the S-curve of the polarization. And there are some of these components which often arise in between these components which we think come from the cone. Sometimes it is not always inside, could be on one side as well. So it does not share that linear polarization angle sweep in the same manner as these components do. And they also seem to have a higher degree of circular polarization in those components than these components tend to show. So such components have been classified as core components of the profile. And Joanna Rankin has been working on this for decades now, where she has classified a large number of pulsars and looked at specific conal components and so on. So it looks like the conal components may have a slightly different origin of radio emission than the core components. It is not universally accepted. There are groups which tend to feel that these core components are not some separate components in themselves, but the cone itself tends to be very patchy, and one of the patches may have properties like the core component that is being talked about. But there does appear to be a set of components in pulsars which behave somewhat differently from the other components. Yeah.
But the circular polarization is certain over there that we have measured, and
that is correct.
How does that fit into the RBM? I mean, we are assuming that things are falling along the magnetic field lines. So how can you produce circular polarization?
Yes. So the interpretation that was given of it was that the core components arises in low gamma particles. And in low gamma particles, you have a larger cone width. In addition, you can see emission at a large angle at nearly 90 degrees with respect to the direction of motion. And at 90 degrees, even synchrotron emission is fully circularly polarized. So if you look at large angle emission from relativistic particle, then it will always be circularly polarized. So the question is, what is the geometry which is allowing you to see this large angle polarization? Clearly, lower Lorentz factor would help. So if you have lower Lorentz factor but smaller radius of curvature, you can still produce the same frequency, but you will have a much wider beam and you can see the circular polarization. So that was what was the first interpretation given of this circularly polarized core components. And because you then mix emission from several lines of sight, several magnetic field lines, what happens is that the linear polarization tends to get averaged out, but the circular polarization always acts, because it depends on whether how your line of sight is moving with respect to the magnetic axis, and that is constant through the entire line of sight. So, and as your magnetic meridian passes through, in this case you would expect a reversal of circular polarization, and that also is seen. The circular polarization is in one sense in one half of the component, and it reverses sense in the other.
The coherence condition is maintained for all this.
Yes, that's right. Coherence condition has to be maintained, otherwise you will not see the emission as strong as you see. But of course, the circular polarization, degree of circular polarization is much less than the degree of linear polarization. So, but these are the classical attributes of the core component. Now, if you take the whole range of core components, even this is not 100% valid in all cases. So there are cases where the circular polarization is very little or is almost not there, but even the rotating vector model doesn't fit. So there are cases like that as well, where although all these things are defining characteristics, not all characteristics may be met in every core component. But nevertheless, it hints to a possibility of a slightly different mechanism of emission occurring within the same range of longitudes. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the energetics. We have now sort of come to the conclusion that the pulsars that we're talking about are rotation powered, which means that the energy that it emits is derived at the cost of its rotational energy. Now, given the timing parameters, it is in fact fairly easy to estimate at what rate rotational energy is being lost from the pulsar. So if you have the angular frequency omega and you have measured the rate of change of angular frequency omega dot, then you take those two, multiply with the moment of inertia. Now this neutron star will have a moment of inertia which is not known a priori. But one can make a reasonably good guess at it from the theoretical models of neutron star structure. And if you look at various different equations of state, here some representative equations of state are plotted here. For the range that you would expect the neutron star masses to be in these radial pulsars, the moment of inertia lies within about a factor of 2, about 1 to 2 times 10 to the 45 grams centimeter square. So within a factor of 2, you can just assume moment of inertia is 10 to the power 45 grams centimeter square. So therefore, you can, with measured period and period derivative, immediately compute the rate at which the rotational energy is being lost. And you would say that that number is well determined to within a factor of 2. Now, how much of this is being seen in the radiation that we are talking about? Now, let's take a look at that. And here is a plot of radiative efficiency. This is the total radiative power in the radiation emitted by the pulsar. Radio contributes a little bit, but it is so small compared to the total, it doesn't matter whether you add the radio or not in the bolometric emission. It is dominated by high energy emission. Now, this line here, so okay, on the vertical axis is the luminosity. Now remember, luminosity has two components. One is the flux that you receive. The other is the distance to the object. And the distance to the object can be uncertain by a fair amount. For radio pulsars, the common method of estimating distance is from dispersion measure. How many of you know about dispersion measure? Okay, it looks like I still have to explain it. So, what happens is the pulsar signal travels through the plasma in the interstellar medium. Now, the interstellar medium plasma, of course, has a dispersion relation, and the phase velocity can be written. It's like the phase velocity is proportional to where omega p is the plasma frequency. So as you can see, as omega approaches omega p, the phase velocity will go to 0. So propagation is not possible at plasma frequency or at frequencies lower than the plasma frequency. But as you go to higher and higher frequencies, your Vp will continue to rise. And at omega equal to infinity, Vp will become 1. Okay, this is Vp by C. So Vp by C will become 1. So signal will move at the speed of light in vacuum. But as you can see, at lower frequencies, there is a frequency dependence of the propagation speed. And so if you observe the same pulse at two different frequencies, then the pulse will arrive at different times because they are moving at different speeds. The actual time difference will depend on what is the length that the signal has traveled, because this gives you a difference in speed, but when you translate it to the difference in time, then you have to multiply the difference in speed times the distance traveled. And using nominal values of the number density of particles in interstellar medium, average numbers, you can then find effective value of omega p, find the dispersion relation, and estimate the distance to the object. Now, since interstellar medium is not an uniform medium, there is fluctuation in plasma density from place to place, and there are also specifically large ionized regions through which your signal can pass through. So the dispersion measure as to how much the plasma frequency really is, that can change from line of sight to line of sight. And although there is some idea of large-scale ionized regions that are present in the interstellar medium, it is not always easy to model this from known observations. So there is always a bit of uncertainty in the distance that you derive out of dispersion measure. There are better ways of measuring distance if the pulsar happens to be closer, and that is if you can measure its proper motion or parallax. So if you can measure its parallax, then you can measure its distance much more accurately. But that is not possible for most pulsars, but for some nearby pulsars it is possible. So this distance goes into the measurement, the estimate of the number in the right frequency. So that itself is a uncertainty that you will have in these numbers.
So presently, with the known idea of interstellar electron density, the known models, what are the typical uncertainties in the distance which get translated from this electron distribution, density distribution models, typically.
But the question is, how will you estimate the uncertainty itself? You need to have independent measure of distance, at least in some cases, to be able to do so. So we can take, for example, pulsars in globular clusters, where the distance to the globular cluster is known, and you can then check against the dispersion measured distance. So this is an exercise that some of us tried to do in the early 90s. And when I did it the first time, I found that the distances were off by factor of 3, factor of 4. The dispersion measured distances. And then based on that, we actually made a model of the vertical distribution of electrons in the galactic plane. So until then, the electron layer was being used as one of infinite scale height. But based on this measurement, we found that it has a scale height of about 1 kiloparsec. So beyond that, the electrons run out, and therefore you cannot keep on adding electrons as you go to objects which are much further away from the galactic plane. So unless you have an independent measure of distance, it is very difficult to even estimate the uncertainties. And right now, all the independent measures of distances that are there have actually gone into making the electron density model. So I would say that it will be quite variable depending on how distant the pulsar is and depending on the direction of the line of sight. It could be even factor of 2, factor of 3 in some cases. So it's not that certain. But in many cases it will be better than that. There is another tool which people are using, as I mentioned, proper motion. So proper motion can be measured just by timing the pulsar as a function of time. So you can basically see the pulsar moving in the sky. But proper motion can also be inferred from the scintillation of the pulsar. So you have inhomogeneities in the electron density which are present in the interstellar medium. So that inhomogeneities in electron density cause inhomogeneity in the refractive index. Okay. So now, as the pulsar, as your line of sight to the pulsar moves through this medium, so let's say this medium is stationary, but since the pulsar is moving, your line of sight is cutting through these irregularities. And as it does so, the effective refractive index is varying. And as a result, there are scintillations that occur. It's the same thing that happens for planetary scintillations. So these refractive index variations lead to scintillations. And from the scintillation time scale, you can get a measure of how fast the pulsar is cutting through, the line of sight to the pulsar is cutting through these irregularities. And that is a measure of proper motion as well. So now, if you have two independent measures of proper motion of a pulsar, then you can use that to infer something about the electron density distribution and hence the dispersion measure distance. Okay, so because your proper motion inferred from scintils and the proper motion actually measured by timing, they have to match. So if they have to match, then the rate of motion through the scintils have to be calibrated to that. And hence the scintil distribution and also the net net refractive index, and hence the net dispersion measure also will be restricted by it. So from that also one can put some constraints on the model of dispersion measure, or model of electron density distribution in the galaxy. So currently all these different pieces of information go into a sort of tabular model of electron density distribution in the galaxy, and this goes by the name NE 2000. Okay. So, this was compiled by Jim Cordes and company, where many measures have gone in, including our measure of the height of the electron layer distribution. So, using that, you can then try to estimate the distances, but you should be aware that there are uncertainties in these distances. Okay. So, coming back here. So now let's take a look at how this total radiative luminosity compares with the spin down luminosity, which is on the horizontal axis. This is E dot in arcs per second, and this is the radiative luminosity, bolometric radiative luminosity as measured by all possible instruments. This dashed line here is the equality line, so where L gamma is equal to E dot. Now there are a few cases where you find that the object seems to be above this line. That is, if it's truly so, then you have to find an alternative source of energy to power these objects. But nobody really believes that they are really above. It is just measurement uncertainty. But a vast majority of them are well below this line. This is the crab. Vela pulsar is somewhere here. Is this one. That is Vela pulsar. So these are some of the close by Young pulsars, and you can see that they are well below this equality line. So radiation does take away a considerable amount of energy, but it doesn't take away all the energy, it appears. Okay. The pulsed radiation. So where is the rest of the energy going? Any guesses? Winds. Okay. So now let's see what that means. Let's go back a little and look at this. Okay. So radiative energy from the crab. This is the pulsed component. As you can see, the maximum it reaches is about 10 to the power of 36 ergs per second. The spin down luminosity is a few times 10 to the 38 ergs per second. And here you can see that it can reach up to 10 to the power of 37 ergs per second, but this is not the pulsar, but the nebula around the pulsar. Okay? So that is radiative luminosity from the nebula around the pulsar. So now let's see what this nebula is and how it is powered, and what does it say about how the pulsar is spending its spin down energy. So almost all young pulsars, which can be studied with some sensitivity, and seem to show a diffuse nebula around it, sometimes big, sometimes small. And how big or how small it is depends on the environment. If the pulsar is sitting inside a confining bubble like a supernova remnant, then they tend to be brighter. If the pulsar is not confined by a supernova remnant, but it's just simply moving in the interstellar medium, creating a bow shock, and then that is restricting the particles, then it tends to be fainter. So basically the wind is still there, but it's sort of tailing off like a comet. Now this is one of the most well-known pulsar wind nebula. It's the Crab Nebula. Now if you take a look at the optical picture of this, you can see that there is all this bright filamentary structure. That bright filamentary structure is producing H-alpha emission, which are thermally excited. So that is a regular gas which has been either ejected in the original supernova explosion or gathered from the interstellar medium. And then in the process of expansion, it's fragmented and produces these filaments. But inside this filamentary cage, you can see this diffuse blue emission. And if you go to wavelengths which are not so dominated by line emission, you can see that diffuse nature much more clearly. Here is infrared. This is far ultraviolet, near ultraviolet from astrosat. This is X-ray from Chandra. This is an expanded version of the X-ray picture with the overlay of the HST, high resolution optical picture. So this emission is clearly diffuse with no specific grainy structure or filamentary structure. In addition, if you look at the spectrum of this, here you see thermal spectrum from the filaments, but for the diffuse part, you see a power law spectrum, non-thermal spectrum of synchrotron radiation, largely from synchrotron radiation. And all these bands which I have shown here is basically dominated by synchrotron radiation in the diffuse emission. So clearly there are highly relativistic particles which have occupied this interior of this supernova remnant. And they then in the local magnetic field produce this non-thermal emission. And where did this large collection of relativistic particles come from? Obviously from the pulsar. Now, if you look at the high resolution optical picture of the inner region of this is really the very central region of this. The pulsar is located here. And you see these ring-like structures around it. And if you keep on observing it, you will find that this is variable, strongly variable. The rings move in and out. And there are also two jet-like structures. So this gives you an indication of how particles are flowing into the nebula. It's clearly flowing from the center, which is where the pulsar is, and then spreading away from the pulsar, and then finally filling the entire nebular volume. And this is what we call pulsar wind. In case of the crab, because of its brightness and its closeness, we are very fortunate to be able to study it in such detail. In X-rays, you can also do so for the Vela to some extent, but this cannot be done for every object. But it's good that nature has given us one sample which you can study in detail. So this is very clear that the pulsar is producing a large number of charged particles which are flowing away from the pulsar, filling the volume. And this population of charged particles then do the radiation from the nebula, which is now shown in this deep black. And as you can see, the larger part of the luminosity actually comes from there. That's more than the luminosity that the pulsar itself produces. So if this is coming at the expense of the energy being injected into the wind, the maximum efficiency can be 100%, and it is very unlikely to be 100%. So the amount of energy which is being carried away by the wind is more than what is coming out in radiation from the nebula. So we have a pulsed component from the pulsar. You get a certain luminosity. Then a non-pulsed steady component, diffuse luminosity from the nebula, which is at least an order of magnitude higher in the case of a crab. And one expects that this luminosity is a fraction of the total energy being input into the nebula via this wind. So the total energy budget from the pulsar then consists of the radiation in photons plus the kinetic energy of particles given into the wind. It's not just the kinetic energy but also the electromagnetic energy, because the wind is not free of electromagnetic field, so it carries both particle energy and magnetic energy. So that is what the pulsar is losing its energy in, and at least in this case it's clear that the component of the energy which is being lost in the wind, which contains the plasma kinetic energy plus magnetic energy, is much higher than the luminosity, radiative luminosity of the pulsar itself. So this is probably true in most pulsars, although we cannot study it in this great detail in many other objects. So the primary mechanism of energy loss in most pulsars would be the pulsar wind, and in the process some fraction of energy which is being dumped into the pulsar wind is also radiated away from very near the pulsar, and that's what gives you the pulsed emission. In case of the crab pulsar, people have tried to model this is the pulsar spectrum going from soft X-rays to high energy gamma rays. People have tried to model this with various different processes. Now this may or may not be correct. This is after all a model. But typically the processes that I talked about are, here there's this green thing which is called secondary synchrotron. Then this is primary synchrotrons. Primary and secondary are the generations of particles that are being produced. So you produce some primary particles by acceleration, then they give rise to a particle cascade, and then secondary generation of particles are produced. So secondary generation of particles will have lower Lorentz factor than the primary generation of particles. So primary synchrotron here, secondary synchrotron here, then there is primary curvature, which is somewhere there, then secondary inverse Compton, and then add it all up, this is the total. So you have many attempts to model this spectrum in detail. This is not an unique decomposition. This is somebody's model. There are other models trying to explain this through different basic mechanisms. But the point is that the entire range of emission here, all this, is entirely non-thermal. The energy distribution of particles which are giving rise to this are non-Boltzmannian. They're all it's a non-thermal. However, a small component of emission from pulsars can also be thermal. And this is not easily seen in all objects, certainly not in bright pulsars that much. But if you look hard enough, then at least in some pulsars you can see this thermal component. Here is a spectrum of VIDA. This is frequency, and this is basically the new F nu. So you have this emission going up, but in soft X-rays you have this bump. So this is part of a non-thermal spectrum, and on top of that sits this thermal hump, which can be fitted by a black body like emission. There is one more object where, again, on top of this is not new F nu, this is F nu. So you have this declining power law, and on top of that there is this interthermal emission. Now people have tried to decompose this thermal emission in trying to model it into two components. One is a cool component, that is somewhat lower energy, and there is a hot component. Again, the projection doesn't seem to show it very well, which is here. And the net radiative area of the cool component is much larger than that of the hot component. So the model is that the cool component is like the entire neutron star sort of cooling down since its birth. The neutron star is born with a very high temperature, around 1 MeV or so, 10 to the power of 10 Kelvin. But gradually it's cooling down as that heat is taken out. And that gives rise to this overall cooling from the entire surface. But there is also enhanced cooling, or one more blackbody component from the polar cap, which is at a higher temperature. Now, which means that those polar caps must be heated by some additional mechanism. And this people have tried to attribute to the fact that when you have pulsar emission, to produce such very large number of charged particles, the easiest way to actually take something and make pairs. So you have electron-positron pairs getting created in the pulsar magnetosphere. And then there is an accelerating voltage by which these particles get accelerated and come out. But accelerating voltage will act oppositely on two different charges. So if one species is accelerated out, another species will be accelerated in. And whichever species is accelerated in will go and hit the polar cap and dissipate energy there and make it hotter. And this small area but higher temperature thermal component is attributed to such processes. Now mind you that we don't have incontrovertible evidence of any of this. But this is what the general idea is in today's model of pulsars. Okay. So, as far as observational evidence goes, which we can relate to while trying to model pulsars, I will conclude here. I'm not going to now add other observational evidences to the kitty. Now start looking at theoretical models and try to relate to some of these observational evidences that we have mentioned in the lecture so far. So before I go into the electromagnetic model, are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so I think which I don't understand is that The emission in radio is coherent emission, and while we talk about the high energy, it's incoherent. Now, how we do the confusion? We calculate the brightness temperature. Now, it's only it's valid for the long wavelength limit. This thing, but I don't find it very convincing. I don't understand that why we also attribute this quantity brightness temperature for X-rays and gamma rays, and then we say that it's incoherent.
Why the high brightness temperature is coherent and low brightness temperature?
Why we calculate this brightness temperature even for a very high energy emission, and then we say that it's incoherent.
So what he means to say is that we define the brightness temperature in the Rayleigh-Jeans limit, the form that we have defined in K.
Yeah, but that is, it doesn't have to be defined that way. You can use the full Planck function to define the brightness temperature.
Yeah, so but in the literature they also use the same formula and apply it to high energy.
That is an approximation, but if you are worried about it, use the full Planck formula.
Okay.
That's a matter of a little bit of sloppy usage. But you can always use the full Planck formula and fit it, and then describe the appropriate brightness temperature. Brightness temperature concept is very secure. It is very well defined. It just means that given a certain intensity measured at a frequency, what is the Planck function that will go through that point? The temperature of that Planck function is called the brightness temperature.
It's through only a particular point.
Only the particular point. So brightness temperature at different frequencies can be different.
So
Because it is not thermal black body distribution.
I'll have bunch of such different temperatures. Then.
Yes. So, but what we do know that if brightness temperature rises above 10 to the power of 12 Kelvin, in a thermal situation or incoherent situation, it is not possible to sustain it, because you will then get into what's called inverse Compton catastrophe. Right? So, inverse Compton catastrophe will cool it below 10 to the 12 K. So, if you really measure brightness temperature which is well above that, then the only way possible is to have coherent emission. So basically 10 to the 12 K is used as the dividing line. If your brightness temperature is well below 10 to the 12 K, then incoherent is allowed. There is no need to go to coherence. But if it is well above that, then there is a need to go to coherence. Any other questions?
So as for the X-ray emission that you see from the polar cap, that is attributed to polar caps, so approximately what percentage of the pulsars do you see this phenomenon is observed?
In how many objects you say?
Yeah.
It's very few actually. Not very many has so far revealed this.
So all these objects are normal pulsars.
Yeah, no.
Not tens of them.
But it is weak, and it's not that easy to see.
So, and also the cap spectrum that you are showing. So if I have to say calculate the total amount of total energy budget, if we calculate, so we have the pulsed component, we take that luminosity plus a efficiency factor multiplied to the emission coming from the nebula.
Okay.
That equals the total energy that it's emitting, right? That's how we can.
That is the premise,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So just come to total energy conservation. Yes.
Yes. That is the only thing what we can start with.
Yes.